Welcome everybody to this latest webinar of the Europe Stories project of the Dahrendorf program. As a Zoom voice just told you, this meeting is being recorded. This was prompted by a really remarkable, provocative, stimulating article written by Hans Kundnani in the New Statesman, which I immediately circulated to our research team at Europe Stories, and everyone found it so interesting, we thought we must try and get Hans to talk to us about it. And I'm delighted to say that he said yes. Hans Kundnani is one of our most stimulating writers on European affairs. He was formerly with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, before that research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, now a senior research fellow at Chatham House. His best known book is probably The Paradox of German Power. And initial responses will come from our three this year's Dahrendorf Scholars. The Dahrendorf Scholars are competitively selected from amongst St. Antony's students, so the creme de la creme. And they are Ione Agboro, who's doing a DPhil in area studies, Laura Ballarini, who's doing an MPhil in development studies, and David Savelyev, who's doing an MPhil in Russian and East European studies. Hans will talk for about 20 minutes, brief responses, 3 to 5 minutes from our Dahrendorf Scholars. And importantly, if you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A. And if you'd like to ask it in person, please just say you would like to ask a question in such and such an area, or you can simply put the question in the Q&A, or you can do it anonymously if you'd like to. With that, over to you, Hans.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the invitation and for those very, very kind words about the essay. And I'll sort of, what I'll say will overlap quite a lot with the essay, but I'll try to say things in a different way, perhaps a slightly more systematic way than I was able to do in that piece. And so, basically, I'm going to talk about two distinct but connected things. Firstly, European identity, and secondly, the history of European integration, the EU, the European project. And I think even that phrase illustrates how closely connected these two things are, the EU and European identity. And I'll basically go through this chronologically. So I'll say something about the idea of Europe and European identity before 1945. And then I'll say something about European integration from 1945 onwards and how that evolved. And then finally, I'll say something about developments in the EU since, basically since 2010, in other words, the last decade or so since the Euro crisis began, but especially since 2015, which I sort of increasingly see as sort of critical juncture in the EU. And in a way, this is the aspect of this that I think is the most important and that I'm most keen to discuss is what is happening in the EU now. And I have a particular thesis about this, which is that so what I call the civilizational turn in the European project. So I think there's a sort of problematic kind of development that has been taking place over the last decade or so, and I'm really keen to discuss that. Before I get though into that sort of chronological account, let me just sort of preface this by saying something about European identity, and in particular, sort of I'd like to sort of disaggregate three different meanings of European identity. In other words, what it means when somebody says, I'm European. I think there are three meanings and they tend to get elided. The first is just a simple statement of fact. When you say I'm European, you're saying I'm from the geographic space called Europe, which by the way includes the United Kingdom, which means that I can say in this sense, I can say in a fairly unproblematic way, I'm European, although not exclusively so, because, and this was something I sort of got into in the essay a little bit, I have this particular biography, my father's Indian, my mother's Dutch, I grew up in Britain. And so I also, for example, think of myself as Asian, as well as being European. So European, even in that sense, can never fully capture my identity. But it's a relatively straightforward version of what it means to be European. Now, the other two are, I think, are slightly different because they're expressions of pride. And in particular, you hear people say, I'm a proud European, which I think can mean two very different things. The first is a statement about cultural or ethnic or civilizational identity. That's obviously problematic. And one example which always strikes me is the German far-right group Pegida, which is an acronym which translated into English stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of Europe. Against the Islamization of the West, the Occident. That, is an illustration that, even people on the far right think of themselves as European, and in a sense as being pro-European, but in this cultural, ethnic, civilizational sense. And then the third version of this, I'm European, is a statement of support for the European Union itself. And I think, for example, when you had Remainers marching in London after the Brexit vote, that's, I think, the sense of I'm European and I'm a proud European that they were expressing. That, I think, is less problematic than the cultural or ethnic version. My problem with it, and I'll sort of come back to this is part of what I'm going to argue, is that it seems to me that it's increasingly detached from reality. In other words, that it focuses on a sort of increasingly imaginary EU. This is the EU as peace project and so on, rather than the real existing EU. And this is where my argument about how the EU has changed comes in. So I'll come back to that. But the crucial point is that these three meanings, I think, tend to get elided a lot. In particular, if you look, say in German, I think the way they get elided is even more extreme, because pro-European and European, there isn't really that distinction in the German language. Germans tend to say, I am European, meaning I'm pro-European. So all of these meanings, I think, get elided. And the reason I mention that is because it seems to me that because of European history, which I'm going to get into, and in particular, the intimate historic relationship between Europeanness and whiteness, it seems to me that pro-Europeans, in other words, people that support the EU and the current form of the European project, should be extremely careful about how they use the term European and how they express their European identity and their pride in that European identity. And in particular, I think they need to be very, very careful about expressing pride or a sense of superiority in relation to their Europeanness, because of the kind of slippage between those two, the second and third meanings of the term. In other words, the sort of ethnic or cultural civilizational version and the version that attaches itself to the EU. And my argument is essentially that pro-Europeans have not done that. They've not been careful. They've been careless about how they use the term. And this has had some problematic consequences. And in particular, it makes it difficult, I think, for pro-Europeans even to recognize the civilizational turn in the European project that I'm pointing to. One more preliminary remark. I think of European identity and the EU in terms of regionalism. It's a kind of regionalism. In other words, it's not something, it's certainly the opposite of nationalism. In some ways, it's rather analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. I know some pro-Europeans don't think of it that way. They think of it as a cosmopolitan project, and European identity and saying I'm European as an expression of cosmopolitanism. To me, that seems extremely Eurocentric. It sort of mistakes Europe for the world. And so, as I say, I think of this in terms of a kind of regionalism. And so like nationalism, it can take different forms. It can be more or less problematic. It can be progressive, it can be reactionary, it can be inclusive, it can be exclusive. And in particular, for the purposes of my argument, it can be either ethnic or cultural, or it can be civic, in the same way that you can have ethnic or cultural nationalism and civic nationalism. And I'll come back to that too, because it seems to me there is this tension in European identity between these two versions of it, between an ethnic cultural version and a civic version. So the origins of this regionalism, it seems to me, are in the medieval era. And I should say, I'm not, by any means a historian of medieval Europe. And if there are historians of medieval Europe who are watching, feel free to correct me. But as far as I can tell, the first reference to Europeans, in other words, people who are European, as opposed to the space called Europe, is in the year 732 in the context of the Battle of Tours or Poitiers. And in that medieval period, it seems to me that what it means to be European is straightforwardly to be Christian. it doesn't get used very often. It sort of crops up occasionally, but it's not a particularly pervasive idea, but it's fairly straightforwardly identified with Christianity. It's really only in the modern era, though, roughly from the sort of 15th century onwards, that Europeanness becomes a more sort of coherent and powerful idea. The idea of Europe as a distinct culture or civilization emerges, in particular, a superior one, a more advanced one, a more rational one, a more civilized one. And in that modern idea of Europe, it's much more complicated than just Christianity. And in particular, that modern identity formation, European identity formation, coincides with the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And so what happens is that the modern idea of Europeanness and the idea of whiteness emerge simultaneously and very much together, and it's very difficult, I think, to disentangle them. And you know, I think if you're not convinced about that, I highly recommend reading something like, you know, the last chapter of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and you see that, you know, European is just a synonym for white, essentially, in that context. Now, the way that some people think about this, and this is how some people responded to my essay, is to say, well, look, at least European identity is more inclusive than national identity. I don't think that's true. Certainly in the UK, empirically, it's not true. Non-white Brits tend to see Britishness as being much more inclusive as an identity than Europeanness. And I think there's a good reason for this, which has, again, to do with identity formation. I'm drawing here on the work of Stuart Hall and others. National identities, Europe, you know, the identities, national identities of nation states in Europe and European identity have different others, or constitutive outsiders, as it's sometimes called. What I mean by that is those identities formed in opposition to different others. So in particular in Europe, national identities tended to form in opposition to each other. A very good example of this is British identity, which, as Linda Colley has shown, forms in opposition to France. Roughly the same story in, I would say, as far as I can tell, most other European countries. European identity, on the other hand, forms in opposition to a non-white or non-European other. And so I think in a sense, actually, European identity is much more problematic even than individual national identities in Europe, but we can come back to that in the discussion if people want to challenge that. So if this is right, though, that historically Europeanness and whiteness are very intimately connected, then I think the crucial question becomes, to what extent did European identity after 1945 represent a break with this historic version of European identity that was so close to whiteness? And my answer is, it wasn't as much of a break as pro-Europeans like to think it was. Pro-Europeans tend to sort of imagine that their version of European identity is totally unconnected to this pre-World War II ethnic cultural version of European identity. It sort of reminds me of the idea of 1945 in Germany as being hour zero, you know, this kind of clean break with the past. P.O. Hansen, a Swedish academic who I'll come back to in a minute, talks about this idea of the EU's immaculate conception. Now, in theory, I think that kind of new identity is possible. In other words, a sense of European identity that is completely disconnected from this ethnic or cultural version. In other words, European identity is not necessarily civilizational. That's not what I've argued. It is, in theory, possible to have a civic regionalism in the same way as you have a civic nationalism. But it seems to me that it would have required a much cleaner break with colonialism, European colonialism, than was historically the case. The actual history is much messier than this. In particular, you know, what becomes the European project has antecedents before 1945. I'm thinking of the Pan-European movement here, which had some of these civilizational and frankly racist tropes in it. But even more importantly than that, the early phase of European integration itself, beginning with the Schuman Plan and then with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, overlaps with the colonial era. In particular, you know, the Treaty of Rome is signed in 1957 in the middle of the Algerian War. you know, in other words, France is fighting a colonial war as this is happening. And this is quite important, this context. Now, this is absolutely extraordinary book on this context by Pio Hansen, who I mentioned, and Stefan Jonsson, called Eurafrica. It came out around 5 years ago. I can't recommend it enough. Of all of the books that I've read on the EU in the last 10 years or so, I think along with Wolfgang Streeck's Buying Time, it's the one that's completely transformed my understanding of the European Union more than any other book I've read. It's an extraordinary fact they point out, which is that when the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957, 75% of the territory that it covered was outside of Europe. In other words, Belgian and French colonies in West Africa mainly. And what Hansen and Jonsson show is that European integration was itself conceived in part as a way for Belgium and France to consolidate their colonial possessions in Africa at a time when they were no longer able to manage them on their own. And in particular, it was a way for them to get West German capital to be able to maintain those colonial possessions. So I think of this as sort of almost like the EU's original sin, and I'm using that term very consciously in a somewhat analogous way to the way that that's used in American history. And certainly it's fascinating to look at how anti-imperialists saw the EU at the time. So for example, Kwame Nkrumah, the Ghanaian independence leader, went so far as to compare the Treaty of Rome to the Congress of Berlin in 1885, at which European powers famously divided up Africa. And he said it created, quote, a new system of collective colonialism, which will be stronger and more dangerous than the old evils we are trying to liquidate. Now, we can argue about whether Nkrumah was right about that, but the crucial point here is that all of this is completely absent from the official narrative of the EU, and by the way, also of European studies, which I think has been complicit in sort of obscuring some of this history. So in other words, the real history is much more complex than pro-Europeans seem to think. And they would like to think that the EU has nothing to do with colonialism. That's a member state story. Some even imagine the EU as an anti-colonial project, which I just think is absurdly ahistorical. So that's the sort of early phase of European integration. And then what happens very quickly, obviously, is that Belgium and France lose those colonies, and that leads to a new phase in European integration. It's still in the context of the Cold War, but it seems to me that the EU at that point, or the EEC as it becomes a sort of increasingly inward-looking project. It sort of focuses on itself rather than the world beyond the European space. And it seems to me actually that this is the period when the EU comes closest to a purely civic regionalism. Now, one really interesting aspect of this, I think, is that it coincides with the emergence of the collective memory of the Holocaust. And so I think what you have is a simultaneous increase in the collective memory of the Holocaust, and at the same time a kind of forgetting about the history of European colonialism, which has now just come to an end. And so what happens, I think, is narrative emerges around the EU, which is about learning the lessons of its own internal history. In other words, how Europeans interacted with each other, culminating in World War II and the Holocaust, but that excludes the lessons from Europe's external history, if I can put it that way. In other words, how Europeans interacted with the rest of the world, in particular colonialism. And this is how I think you get to this point where pro-Europeans believe that the EU has nothing to do with colonialism. It's certainly not, as I say, in any sense, based on learning the lessons of that history. It's just completely absent from the story. Then I think, and I'm going to sort of speed up a bit, then I think you get a new phase after the end of the Cold War, where the EU becomes more outward-looking again in the context of enlargement and so on. And in this context, there's a kind of a renewed civilizing mission, actually, that emerges. And Jan Zielonka, who for a long time was at St. Antony's, and I think even maybe watching, has written, I think, very eloquently and persuasively about this new civilizing mission. I think you start to get the sort of re-emergence of a sense of European superiority, actually. Now, it's relatively benign, it seems to me, because this sense of superiority is based specifically on the EU as a mode of governance and the social market economy and even the welfare state. But nevertheless, you do get this idea of a certain kind of European superiority, and the idea of the EU as a civilian power, I think is part of that story. Now, I think that what's happened since 2010, and this is the last sort of piece of the sort of narrative about history of the European project that I'll share. I think what's happened is that pro-Europeans have become much more defensive. You have this series of crises that have hit the EU. The idea of the EU as a model, which had previously, in that earlier phase when the EU was sort of exporting that model or trying to export that model around the world, that idea of the EU as a model, I think, sort of loses credibility and loses traction. There's a backlash against internally against the EU's mode of technocratic governance. Austerity undercuts the idea of the social market economy. At this point, EU member states are dismantling their welfare states. It's in part through the EU that those welfare states are being dismantled. And so I think the aspects of the EU model that pro-Europeans had previously sort of tried to export, they just lose credibility. And in that sense, in that context, I think pro-Europeans have come to see the EU less as a model and more as a competitor in an increasingly hostile world. In other words, it's less about exporting aspects of the EU and more about defending it. And then in 2015, the refugee crisis, the next in this series of crises, and that further gives momentum to the far right. Obviously, there's a longer history before 2015, but the far right is particularly strengthened by the refugee crisis. And it seems to me that in response to that, what we've had in the EU is the emergence of these increasingly civilizational kind of tropes. And I think probably the best embodiment of this is the new EU Commissioner for Protecting the European Way of Life, whose job is essentially to keep migrants out. And by framing it in that way, what you're essentially saying is that migration is not just a difficult policy problem to be tackled, but that migrants are a threat to the European way of life. That seems to me is nothing if not civilizational. And I also think that this civilizationalism is now creeping into European foreign policy debates. And this is one of the things that prompted me to write that essay. In particular, I think it's now starting to merge with these ideas around European sovereignty. And in particular, Emmanuel Macron, I think, probably embodies this more than anyone else. He's given speeches where he makes this very, very explicit, that for him, European sovereignty is about defending European civilization. And so I think you have this idea increasingly of Europe as a civilization that is endangered, and has to be defended, kind of defensive civilizationalism that has emerged. And so I think essentially, and this is at least my interpretation of what's been happening in the last 10, especially 5 years, is that there's been a kind of a shift away from the earlier, more civic regionalism to something that is much more ethnic, cultural, civilizational. And this raises a question, and this is where I'll end, which is whiteness actually becoming more central, not less central, to the European project? I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the responses from the three Dahrendorf scholars and from everyone else.
Thank you very much, Hans. That was terrific. Two quick comments. First of all, I think in your historical part, it's really important to mention Islam. I mean, from 732 to Pope Pius II, who started talking about Europe rather than Christianitas. The other was not the colonial world, it was Islam. The second point is, I think it's fair to say, I mean, I think your criticism of European studies is absolutely justified, but I think in recent years, particularly historians, have put the intertwinedness of empire and the early decades of the European Union front and center stage. Timothy Snyder in his Dahrendorf lecture here a couple of years ago, our colleague Paul Betts in his book Ruin and Renewal. It's actually, so the historians have really got that. With those two comments, let me hand over to our Dahrendorf scholars, but let me say to you also, feel free to say also a word or two about just how it feels to you, whether it simply feels to you that Europeanness is more exclusive, or when I say I'm being European, I say one of those things. Laura, would you like to kick off?
Yes, here we go. Yes, so actually I'm gonna kind of take the lead from what Timothy just said, because how I prepared my answer, like, and how I thought about my answer after reading your article is actually in a very personal way. So, and that's what I'm also gonna speak about. So, exactly. So I would like to start by stating that I do find myself in agreement with the central claim raised by Hans Kundranini. So that namely that being European not only meant historically being white, but it still means being white. However, differently from what Anne said, I will not use historical records or current policies or mention like particular political figures, because that's not my field of expertise. So I'm not going to speak about that, but I will draw my own personal experience. So my response is going to be maybe a rather unconventional one, but it's a very viscerally personal one. So to begin with, I think I should clarify my own identity as a European. So I am a white European. I grew up in Italy, in Milan, which is probably one of the richest and most European cities of Europe, if we want to say like that. But it's still an Italian city. So it is still like in a rather complex relation, I would say, with Europe to some extent. But then I moved to Amsterdam, and which is an even more European city, if we want to call it like that, to do my bachelor in the social science. I honestly loved my European identity, differently from many of my friends back in Italy, who maybe had very different contrasting views on Europe, because Europe was always, in Italy, has always this kind of double role. On the one side, it's the savior when it's convenient, and sometimes it's actually what like kind of like, yeah, what we blame everything on. So it's not the like, I would say the like when I met Dutch people and so how they define themselves as European was very different from how my friends would define themselves as European. But I felt I was different from many of my friends because I lived in Amsterdam, I moved around, I loved my European identity. I thought it was really just a great asset that could like mean exactly having friends from all over Europe, moving around, studying in different cities, and that was all that I thought about, honestly. And that's where something started to change, because I started to realize that I never even reflected on my European identity, never even questioned what that actually means. I just took it for granted. And this might sound a little bit weird, but I actually never even realized that I was white myself, and that all my friends, all the people that I met throughout my entire education were white as well. So what I think I came to realize while I started to like think about my European identity is that throughout my entire education, I was never confronted with the issue of colonialism or with colonialism or with the issue of race. Because in Italy, this is not a problem people speak about unless you reference to the refugee and the immigration crisis. But even in that case, it is framed in a very different way. So, and even if I live in two of the most European cities, as I said at the beginning, and even if I study a social science subject, I never, and I would like to emphasize again, never even knew about the colonial history of Italy, as well as of the rest of Europe. Colonialism, race, whiteness, blackness are not even taboos. They were not even taboos in my personal education. They were just not topic at all, until the point in which I arrived in Oxford and I started to confront myself with these issues, specifically because of the type of studies that I started, which is the M.Phil in development studies. So yes, for me, being European meant being white, and that was what it was for basically exactly my entire education. But when I moved to Oxford, something started to slightly change. The readings that I was doing, mostly combined with the people that I was met, opened my eyes to colonialism. It's a little bit weird to say again, but it's like I discovered that Europe was like a colonial, like that there was engaged in colonialism so much. Of course, I knew that it was before, but I never really engaged with it. And I never really, as well as all my friends in Milan or all my friends in Amsterdam, that was just not a topic. And here in Oxford, I spent sleepless nights thinking almost like every day about what Europeans did, what they still do, and how crazy it was that for almost 25 years of my entire life, I never engaged with that. Neither did my family, nor did my friends, nor did my privileged education. So to summarize what, like for me, because this is a very personal issue at the end. So yes, I do still see European as being a synonym of whiteness. And so I do agree with Hans' assertion that the European Union is in part a white project, or to some extent, maybe still a civilization project. But exactly, I did not use historical records or current foreign policy, but I used my very own education and my very own experience to claim that. And how I want to conclude my intervention is by on a more positive note. I don't want to believe that that's it. Because yes, Europe maybe was born as a civilization and a white project. And maybe yes, Europe is still a civilization and a white project to some extent, but it does not have to be this way. I think that the first necessary step which needs to be taken to make the current white European Union the European Union is to open up educational curriculum and to actually start speaking and thinking about colonialism, race, whiteness, blackness. These are tough topics. And as I said, I did not sleep for nights when I discovered colonialism and when I started to grapple with these issues. But these are topics that young Europeans need to start facing and need to start engaging, because it is part of our history. It is still part of our life. And even if we may not deny it, or we may not be confronted with it many times. So that's why I would like to thank Hans for bringing this issue up, because this is a very important issue. And I think that generating this discussion about race and whiteness and colonialism is essential in Europe and essential among young Europeans. So yeah, thank you. And sorry, maybe this was a bit unconventional.
No, wonderful. Laura, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. Ione.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think I'll start the way Laura started and I guess define my Europeanness. So I'm Black British with Irish roots, but I was either raised or educated in multiple European countries, including Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, and France. So I've had like a full European experience. So my response is also going to be deeply personal, and I'm going to have, and it's in 3 parts. So firstly, I really enjoyed your discussion on the sanitization of European Union history, because I think it's something that's not spoken about a lot. And I think it's reflective of the issues that are ongoing in many of its constituent nations, including the United Kingdom when we were still in the European Union, where we sanitize our history and we don't teach our citizens the full history of colonialism. And I wonder, when I look at Laura's point, what the solution to that might be, because she mentioned education, that as right now we don't have a European Union syllabus or like a transnational curriculum. So I wonder how we go about educating citizens in individual countries both about the history of the European Union and about the history of their nations in turn. My second point is a response to your definitions of European identity, which were in 3 parts. And I would like to propose maybe like a 4th definition, which I think you hinted at a bit when you spoke about civic identity, and that's the legal identity that holding a European Union citizenship gives you. So as a Black, British person, me and my family and friends, we were often able to use our European Union citizenship to assert our right to belong and exist in European Union countries in the face of racism. Because when you're in a country like France or the United Kingdom, you can use the colonial history of that country to assert your right to be there. However, many European countries don't have that colonial history, or they were colonizers within the European space rather than, in Africa or in Asia. And so in the face of systemic racism in those countries, or questions of my identity and belonging in those countries, my European citizenship became a powerful rhetorical tool. Furthermore, you speak a lot about like the European Union being framed as whiteness, but I felt like often, at least from my perspective, often national identity in the European Union, so the different constituent nations, frame identity as whiteness, and then they once again overlook or whitewash their colonialism. Whereas the European Union is a bit more multicultural, and while it's imperfect, me and my family could still claim a stake as like one of the many ethnicities that belong to the European Union in the face of, once again, these narratives of whiteness, which leads me to my last point. You spoke about like non-white British people finding British identity to be more inclusive than European Union identity. And I wonder if this also speaks to the fact that within the United Kingdom, we don't tend to know a lot about the European Union. And I find that, you know, prior to Brexit, I would say that British citizens were the least likely to participate in the European Union in terms of the overall population, because I often found that what happened when I was like growing up in Austria, growing up in France, is that I was able to belong to a wider diasporic European community. So like the Black French community and the Black German community, and we all existed in community with each other, which makes me think about the difference between institutional rhetoric, what the different, you know, members of the institution might be saying, versus your life within that institution. And I think life within the European Union and the freedoms it allowed us to create these transnational communities, which is what I think many different Europeans with many different identities tend to do. So yeah, that's my response.
That's wonderful. Ione is actually working on some aspects of this transnational, as it were, Black Europeanness. I mean, Ian, if I can just push you a teeny bit on that, do I hear you right to say that you're not so persuaded that, I can't generalize about Black British people, that Britishness is actually felt to be a more inclusive identity than Europeanness?
Yeah, I'm not that persuaded by it. I think that, and I know that I have a very unique experience of having grown up and lived in many different European countries, and then being Black British. I don't find this identity to be any more inclusive. I would already say it's just as inclusive or less inclusive in some ways, but that's just, yeah, my.
But Europe offers an alternative, which is obviously an enhancement.
Yeah, I think it's an enhancement. Yeah, I think there's something about being able to belong to this transnational community and to not have to define yourself solely through nationalistic terms.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ione. That was terrific also. David.
Thank you. So just like speakers before me, I will start by defining sort of my identity, I guess. I'm in a bit of a weird position here because I actually look at the European identity as an outsider. I'm Russian American and I'm Jewish. So all three of my identities historically have been othered in Europe. We were always on the periphery of Europe, if you will, but never truly entirely European. So I definitely want to say that I agree with the overall point. I do think that whiteness is very important, and definitely historically whiteness has been a defining feature of European identity. I would add a little bit to your definition, though, in that I think it is not necessarily about whiteness as, you know, as a pure sort of genetic trait, if you will, but it is more about cultural whiteness. And you can see in the way Europeans historically treated people like the Jews or the Roma, or, you know, or even Eastern Europeans, what have you, who appear to be white, obviously, and who are white. You can look at me. I'm pretty white, but you know, we still treat it a bit differently. Obviously, not as differently as, you know, as Black people or Asian people would be treated. So I think cultural whiteness, which is the sort of peculiar locus between you know, Christianity, Western Europeanness, this sort of Enlightenment, Enlightenment, industrialization. I think that is more important than just whiteness in a sort of in an ethnic, in a racial sense. So a lot of it is about culture, about social constructs. So that's at least my experience of interacting with Europeans, interacting with Europeans as Russian, interacting with Europeans as American, interacting with Europeans as a Jew. I would go a bit further, and I think I would challenge your overall claim to some extent. And I think I would be drawing on a lot of what Ione actually said. about the transnationality of European identity. And I think that we can safely argue that the European Union right now is on a bit of a precipice. And I mean, I would use this opportunity to sort of plug the report that we at Dahrendorf have recently, I believe, released, the European Stories, where we, polled what young Europeans think about Europe and what the EU should do. And one of the main things that young Europeans think that the EU should do is it should play a more active role in the world. It should, help solve climate change, work with refugees, have a bit of a more assertive foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this defines the sort of this grand struggle that the EU is about to have, because the EU has to create a coherent identity for itself. And right now, I would totally agree with you, Hans, that the EU pretty much can't define an identity. Europeans can't define identity for themselves outside of this cultural whiteness. They can't define an identity for themselves outside of this sort of inherent connection to the European past. Why? Because for several decades in existence, the European Union couldn't create a distinct European identity. If you look at all kinds of imagined, newly created states, I'm in a Russian study department, and I work a lot with sort of early Soviet Union. We can see this sort of global cultures emerging literally within the span of few days. In the USSR, we can see something similar like that happening in the United States, et cetera. These states, well, not states, but polities that sort of that create these global cultures within a few years. Really, the EU hasn't really done that. The EU does not have a cultural zeitgeist that is distinctly EU. It has cultural zeitgeist that draws on multiple heritages from Germany, France, from all the European member states, and all these heritage items, all these identities are intrinsically tied to whiteness. And so especially now, if the EU wants the status of a global superpower, which it might as well need, seeing how the United States seems to be preoccupied with our affairs in Asia, the EU might have no other choice but to look to whiteness in order to define itself. So I think, but however, the EU also have, and I'll be really brief here, but I really like how you quoted Kwame Nkrumah, the Ghanaian revolutionary leader, when he referred to the Treaty of Rome as a Congress of Berlin. And while it is true that the European Union was founded on the colonial principles, you can still see a sort of a line of progress that probably, I would still argue, is moving away from colonialism to many degrees. I mean, the European nations have forsaken many of the colonies. The European Union the European nations, the European countries have tremendous internal debate in academia, in policy, etc., that that is aimed to kind of come to terms with their origins as colonial nations. And of course, they're not doing enough. But they're still doing quite a lot. So I think that right now there is really, again, there is a precipice, there is a choice that the European Union would have to make. Are they to become a sort of a global cohesive superpower that is rooted in whiteness, or do they take a pause and they think more critically about their past? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was also great. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, but Hans, would you like to come back quickly and pick up any of those points?
I'll try to be extremely brief, because I would love to hear, and there's loads of really interesting people who are watching I'd love to hear from. So maybe just one point. It's been quite interesting that the reactions that I got to the New Statesman piece, it did start to seem to me as if on this question of to what extent one can identify as European, it did start to seem to me as this kind of a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, those most likely to be able to very enthusiastically say, I'm European, are kind of people like Laura, frankly. which are white Europeans whose biographies or whose family histories cross European borders, but only cross European borders, right? So in other words, if you've lived in, Germany and the Netherlands and Italy and France, you're bound to think of yourself as or for example, if you have one French parent and one Italian parent, you're bound to think of yourself as European, as your sort of primary identity. And then I think at the other end of the spectrum are non-white Brits. Because Brits, I think in any case, even white Brits are less likely than continental Europeans to think of themselves as European. And then within the category of Brits, non-white Brits are even less likely to think of themselves as European. And I have to say, Ione, it's a really interesting, your perspective is really interesting because you have elements of both of these kind of extremes, as it were, right? In the sense that you're a non-white Brit, but then you've also lived in various continental European countries in a way that most non-white Brits haven't. And I think that the polling, that we do have very good data on this in Britain, is very, very clear. That the majority of Brits of Asian and African Caribbean origin just don't see themselves as being European. They see Europe as a very exclusive identity. They basically see, continental European countries as being more racist than Britain is. There's a whole series of reasons why they don't identify as European. So I think that's fairly clear from the data. The problem is we don't have data about most continental European countries because most continental European countries don't collect data by ethnicity. So we simply don't know what non-white French people think or what non-white Italian people think. We just don't know. It's a real problem. So, I can go by my own personal experience as a Brit and I can look at the data about Britain, but the rest is kind of speculation. There's lots more I'd love to respond to, but I'd love to hear more thoughts from other people.
Brilliant. That's a very interesting point. Let's have a look at the Q&A. And Hans, rather than me being a kind of ventriloquist, why don't you take the questions from there? And if you wouldn't mind reading out or giving the gist of the question you want to answer, and feel free to pick and choose.
Okay, shall I do that now?
Yeah. Or do you want to have a moment for doing that?
Yes. If maybe I don't know if someone else wants to chip in for a minute while I just take a look at them.
Yeah, brilliant. Why don't you? Would anyone else like to come back in on what Hans just said?
I'll just make a quippy remark and be like, I guess my Darendorf Scholar project is on trying to understand a little bit more about non-white European communities. So hopefully I will be contributing a tiny bit to that data so that we can see where they fall on that spectrum.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. And maybe we should even try and do some polling on that if it's possible. Laura.
Yeah, no, and instead, because mine is kind of complementary to Ione, actually, I'm trying to look how much white Europeans actually understand of exactly colonialism, race, whiteness, and how much they actually know and actually grapple with the fact that they are white. And so, because I think it's something that it's very confronting to come to terms with. So it's kind of I don't know, interlocking with Ione. So I don't know, maybe that is another angle to look at it.
Terrific. And those will be Darendorf essays, which will be up on the website in the autumn. Hans, would you like to pick and choose?
Yeah. And I would like to come back to this question of I suppose one thing that runs through several of the responses, but also several of the questions, is this sort of implicit sort of comparison between sort of nation states, and in the case of the EU member states, versus the EU, both as an identity, but also as a sort of polity. And which of the two is more multicultural? So Ione was talking about transnational networks and so on. Which of the two is more inclusive? And I think several people have sort of, and Ione kind of suggested this too, that in some ways the EU is a more sort of inclusive, diverse, multicultural kind of identity or polity. I guess I sort of, in general, it seems to me that when people say that, often they, as I sort of mentioned, are somewhat sort of confusing diversity within Europe with the whole world, right? So, and you hear this a lot when people talk about, how fantastic it is to work in Brussels because it's so diverse, right? And when people say that, these are people working in the EU institutions and so on, they're not talking about, you know, West African communities that live in Brussels. They're talking basically about the nationalities of people that work in the EU institutions and all the connected kind of organizations. And that is sort of overwhelmingly white. You know, in fact, it seems to me, and again, we don't have the data, it seems to me that it's sort of often, you know, the representation of minorities in Brussels from all of those different EU member states is actually even lower than it is in the individual institutions in those member states, right? So my impression is, for example, that the representation of non-white people from France, you know, who represent France in Brussels, is even worse than in French institutions like, you know, the Assemblée Nationale and so on. At the same time, I take Iona's point about sort of there is a potential for example, non-white communities in different EU member states to link up. But here, I don't quite see why the EU particularly facilitates that, because, you know, clearly that there are diaspora links, you know, across different countries. I mean, Paul Gilroy, for example, wrote about the Black Atlantic, right, which is precisely this idea of a kind of a diasporic kind of network linking Britain and America and the Caribbean and Africa, right? Now, I don't really see why you have to be in the EU in order to be able to do that. I don't quite see why the EU, in a sense, benefits that kind of transnational network. And then sort of conversely, also, I thought it was interesting, the point that you made, Iona, about how having an EU passport, you know, sort of red EU passport, gave you a certain kind of power, which is a really interesting point that I'd never really thought about. But I guess my first thought was, well, if you think about, say, racism in the United States against African Americans, I mean, being a US citizen doesn't really help you, right? If you're being, you know, stopped by the cops or being disadvantaged in the labor market or whatever. I mean, the fact that you're a US citizen, I don't think really helps. Now, I take the point that it's slightly different in the case of an immigrant. But I suppose I'm a little skeptical that simply being an EU citizen gives you much power.
Iona, would you like to respond briefly to that?
Sure, I'll respond briefly. So I guess to your first point about the Black Atlantic, I think that is a massive difference. I mean, yes, there's a Black diaspora community. I have several aunties, for example, in America or in Canada, but, you know, to use this pandemic as an example, I can't get up right now and see my aunties there and, you know, spend time with my family there. It's not possible. I don't exist in the same political space as them, and that becomes very apparent in this coronavirus time. However, as Timothy was actually speaking before we started this talk, if we were still in the European Union, I could get up and visit my auntie in France and sit in her house for several hours and talk to her. So I think that, yeah, there is a deeper sense of integration between like the Black diaspora communities that things like free movement from the European Union facilitated. Sorry, so then your second point was about the passports. I think I don't want to speak for the African American experience because that's not my experience. I'm not part of that Black community, so I wouldn't feel right to speak for how they exist within, how they navigate their lives within America. However, once again, I do think that there is power in citizenship. There's a reason, you know, we debate it so much. There's a reason people cried after Brexit. There's a reason we're even having this conversation right now, because there's power in citizenship and what it means. And I think that, yeah, that was an important tool for many people who lived in Austria or who lived in these different communities who were ethnic to have that citizenship. I think we can obviously debate the ethics of that, you know, in the face of things like the European Union immigration policy, what it means to be an ethnic person and have that citizenship versus what it means to not have that citizenship as an ethnic person within the European space. But I don't think that negates the fact that that citizenship protected people and gave them abilities to assert their sense of belonging within European spaces, yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Let me just add to that. Of course, you and maybe you're luckier than me. I at least have just been stripped of my European citizenship by the vote of my compatriots, and you know, it is a painful fact that the reality of citizenship was not individual at all. It did not attach to my person at all as a human being or as a citizen. It was entirely at the whim and will of the member state. And so I think that, you know, I think Brexit makes us very conscious about that problematic and weak nature of European citizenship, fundamentally, right? Where, you know, because only otherwise in extreme cases can an individual be stripped of their, say, US citizenship. It is something very strong and very foundational and fundamental about your sense of identity and your sense of personal freedom. Now, David, do you want to jump in quickly here, and then I'm going to pick out a couple of questions from the audience?
I mean, my point was just briefly, I think, on the power of citizenship, because the passport privilege is a very real thing. It's extremely real, and there is a reason, especially in the United States. I mean, I obviously don't want to speak for Black people in America, but I covered Black Lives Matter protests as a journalist in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, and I know very well how different the situations are for, you know, people of color in the States who do have a passport, who do have a citizenship, who do have a green card, versus those who don't. And for those who don't, it's much significantly worse. And, you know, then on the other side of the Atlantic in Russia, there is actually, there is a saying about European passports or American passports. They call them паспорт белого человека, the white person's passport.
Yes,
and by that they mean,
yep,
you know, they don't necessarily mean that all Europeans are white, but they mean that they get enormous privilege guaranteed by those documents.
Yeah, it's a great point. My Polish friends in the 1980s would talk about you over there where the white man lives. And so it was the same association, but seen from the other side. Now, Hans, I'm going to pick out 3 questions and throw them at you. One is from Celia Belin. And basically it's this: don't you usually find that particularly young Europeans who are pro-European are pushing back against internal nationalism, against xenophobia, against rejection of the other people? In other words, they are actually much more tolerant and open and favorable towards minorities. The second one is from Hidetoshi Nakamura. Nice to see you again, Hans, he says. And basically, the question is this. I'm going to put in my own words. When European member states or the EU promotes human rights abroad in authoritarian regimes, they're sometimes accused of being neo-colonial. How should we respond to that? Isn't that, as it were, a positive flip side of this, that we are at least trying to realize some of these rights in other countries and then being denounced as neo-colonial? And the third set of questions from Martin Sandbu, who's obviously been having this argument with you for some time, but I think this is a very useful clarification from Martin. Point 1, shouldn't we distinguish between ethnic, cultural, and civilizational? 3 different things. For example, a civilizational identity can be open. In the European case, that would presumably something built on commitment to Enlightenment rationalism and the social market economy. And I would reinforce that point because it seems to me that much of the discourse, for example, around immigration is about Western Christian civilization as against Islam and Muslims. Second point he makes is the non-white British phenomenon you talk about. Doesn't that have much to do with the polarization in British politics, particularly in Brexit Britain, between being British and being European? So you're kind of compelled to choose, right? I've seen several UKIP candidates of Asian British background. And the third thing is, don't you have also to control for class and educational background? Yeah. You're talking about it as being white British, but maybe it's being poorer British or less higher education British. Would you like to take on those 3?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for you did a better job than I did of sort of multitasking. I was really struggling because there's such long, brilliant questions. And thank you also for picking out those 3 because they're all friends of mine and all really great questions as well. So, I mean, first of all, to Celia, So yes, so I guess what you're sort of suggesting is that in practice, despite my kind of theoretical points, in practice, pro-Europeans are, if not cosmopolitans, then at least more tolerant, less likely to be racist, and so on, than Eurosceptics. Now that may be true. I guess I feel as if it's a little binary, because I think we have this tendency to think in these very binary terms: liberal, illiberal, nationalist, internationalist, and I think the reality is a little bit more complex. In particular, and Celia is from France, so this is particularly relevant. It does seem to me, this was part of my point at the end about Macron and the sort of civilizational tropes in European foreign policy discourse. It does seem to me that what is happening in France is that under pressure from the far right, you're starting to have a version of some of these essentially far-right civilizational tropes, but at the European level rather than at the national level. I mean, that does seem to me to be a big part of Macron's kind of strategy. The far right in France talks about national sovereignty. Macron talks about European sovereignty. He talks about European civilization. So I think part of why I'm worried about thinking in this quite binary way is because it sort of obscures this danger that, what happens if you have kind of a far right version of the EU? That's part of the sort of possibility that I'm kind of pointing to. And this is why I sort of started out by talking about regionalism and nationalism, because I think there's this tendency, and I think this is where this binary thinking leads you, to think that because this isn't nationalism, because this is European, you're pro-European, you're in favour of the EU, and you're thinking at this European level rather than in national terms, is somehow you're immune from these problematic elements of nationalism. It seems to me that you can have exactly the same things at the regional level. And in fact, they can be even more dangerous, I think, at the regional level, partly because they're more difficult to see, but also potentially because, the EU, as a continental size actor, is much more powerful than any individual EU member state is. So I think this is potentially even more dangerous, but certainly it's possible to have some of these problematic aspects of nationalism at the European level. And I think...
If I may, can I just jump in there quickly? Because if Emmanuel Macron were with us now, and maybe he is, he would furiously deny that it had anything to do with color, with ethnicity. And after all, the whole French notion of nationality is that it's not about ethnicity. He would say it's defending the values of the Enlightenment. So how would you answer Emmanuel?
That brings us perfectly onto Martin's question, right? Because that's kind of what Martin is saying, is we need to distinguish between ethnic, cultural, and civilizational. Now, I think we need several hours to do that, because I find it very, very difficult to disentangle those things. There may have been a sort of bit of a historical kind of evolution from a kind of form of racism, I suppose, that is based on ethnicity to one that's based on culture to one that's based on civilization. Even that, though, I think is way too simplistic. It's much more complicated. I think they've always gone hand in hand. And this is precisely where I think the Enlightenment, for example, becomes really interesting, which Martin mentioned. And we haven't been arguing about this for ages, but Martin did do a response to my New Statesman essay in which he made this argument that, and lots of people have made this argument in response to my piece, that, but you don't understand, the EU is a universalist project based on Enlightenment values. To which my response is, well, yes, but colonialism was also carried out in the name of Enlightenment values. That's precisely the problem. So, it's too easy to simply point to Enlightenment values or to the universalism of the universalist aspirations of the EU in order to say, well, then it's not problematic. I think what always happens is these universalist projects they come out of a particular cultural context. And so there's always this tension, I think, between universalism and particularism, whether you're talking about a national project or the European project. So I guess my answer to Martin's point on that is, I just don't think you can separate out the ethnic and the cultural and the civilizational, at least not in a clean kind of way. They've gone historically together so closely that I think it's quite difficult actually to untangle them. Now, the point about the social market economy is a different one. And that's really interesting. Because when I talked earlier on about the earlier version of the European project, in particular, during the Cold War, but then also in the immediate post-Cold War period when the EU was trying to export its model, I think it, I sort of suggested this was a more civic kind of regionalism rather than the more ethnic or cultural or civilizational kind of version that we have now. It's precisely because it was based on those things like the social market economy. And my interpretation of what's happened is that, as I say, it's simply no longer credible for the Europeans to say, unlike the rest of the world, we stand for the social market economy and for the welfare state. Because, over the last 30, 40 years across Europe, we've been dismantling precisely that model. And as I mentioned as well, it's partly the EU that has been driving that dismantling of the social market economy and the welfare state. And so, it simply is no longer persuasive internally, let alone externally, to say this is what Europe stands for. I just don't think it kind of works. So I think that would be a kind of a civic regionalism, and I would love to see that, the development of that kind of civic regionalism based on a kind of a European model. But it seems to me that the EU is moving in completely the opposite direction to that. Then on Martin's other point about the non-white British population, is this actually just a function of polarization? I don't know, it's a good question. I mean, I think, and I said this in the original New Statesman essay, that I'm the first to admit that this may be a kind of British exceptionalism, that Brits, just non-white Brits, just do look at this differently than non-white French people do. I don't know, and as I mentioned earlier, part of the problem is we don't have the data, so we can't retest this. But it may be that there's something particularly British going on here, and then in turn that may have something to do with the polarization. I don't really have a good answer to that. But I think what I think is clear from the data we have is that even those non-white Brits that voted to remain, and it was sort of 2/3 voted to remain, about a third of non-white Brits voted to leave, even those that voted to remain didn't have a strong sense of European identity. And they kind of saw it as the lesser of two evils. They were particularly skeptical of the Leave campaign, particularly the figures associated with it, and so they voted to remain sort of almost by default, rather than because they were passionate Europeans, let alone pro-Europeans. And then finally, the class point is very interesting too. Again, I don't have a good answer. I wonder if, at least in the British case, I think regional sort of location has a lot to do with it. So I think, if you're a non-white Brit in London, I think that looks very different than if you're in, Bolton, for example. And then I haven't answered Hidetoshi's question. Lovely to see you again too, or to hear you again at least. Yes, this question of should Europeans kind of lecture others around the world on various issues because there is this potential for you to be accused of being colonial. Again, this kind of slightly brings me back to the point about the Enlightenment. This is, I think, just a dilemma there's no easy solution to this. It's not simply that others will accuse Europeans of a kind of neo-colonialism, but there is a reality to that continuity, which is that during the history of colonialism, Europeans thought they were civilizing the rest of the world too. And so I just think this is an intractable kind of problem, and all we can really do is just sort of be aware of this difficulty and this tension and this history, and be conscious of it. I don't think there's a simple solution to that.
Hans, it's because it seems to me, and we talked earlier about how you might develop this into a longer piece of writing. I think where your argument is most vulnerable is precisely in this question of whether one cannot disentangle ethnic, cultural, and civilizational. And to say, as you did, well, in the past, they were all intertwined. Well, lots of things were intertwined in the past that we've now tried to disentangle. And in a way, you could read the European project, if you wanted to read it optimistically, as an attempt to move first from the ethnic to the cultural. So in the 1950s, it was about Western Christian civilization, but then from the cultural to the civilizational, understood as a civilizational to which people of all ethnicities and all cultures and all other backgrounds can belong and where they can feel at home, which is how I personally would understand the European project at its best. And indeed, Europe isn't going to survive very long if it isn't that, because it has tens of millions of people of different ethnic and cultural and religious backgrounds. So it seems to me that the challenge for you is going to be, and don't feel the need to respond to this immediately, but the challenge is going to be to explain why one can't distinguish clearly between ethnic, cultural, and civilizational, or in other words, to put the question a different way, between the past and the present. That is to say, in the past, Europeans didn't disentangle these things, but we're really trying quite hard to do so now.
If I could just clarify, just very briefly, because I wasn't saying it's impossible. I was just saying it's very, very difficult. And that I guess the crucial thing is on what basis you do that. My argument is that you can't even begin that project of developing something like a European civic regionalism without a much greater awareness of European history, including the impact that Europeans had on the rest of the world, as opposed to just the impact the Europeans had on each other, and sort of recognizing the way in which things like the Enlightenment are implicated in that. That's really all I was saying.
Absolutely. I mean, put in that way, I think it's an overwhelmingly compelling argument that we have to start by problematizing our own understanding of what it means to be a European and confronting that history about which we're scandalously ignorant / complacent. I mean, that's Laura said it very well, so have others. But that takes me to another question which I wanted to highlight, which is, okay, here we are talking about the colonial legacies in the past. The question is from Oliver Story. Can you explain the trade terms that exist between Europe and the rest of the world, particularly Africa, and say how the colonial trends have not continued, or maybe the question is, have continued? So if I can broaden that out slightly, shouldn't we be talking more about what Europe is still doing to the rest of the world today, rather than what it did 30 or 50 years ago?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I'm afraid I'm not enough of an expert either on Africa itself or on EU-Africa relations to be able to give much of an answer to that. Except, all I will say is that lots of people, including Per Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, the authors of the book Eurafrica that I mentioned earlier, lots of people do argue that there is a certain kind of continuity here, actually, that even if one doesn't go quite as far as Nkrumah did, that relations between the EU and Africa have remained, in some sense, sort of neo-colonial. Now, one would need to get into the exact details of the trade arrangements and so on, but certainly that is precisely the argument that it's not as if somehow now the EU and Africa interact as equals. I mean, that's also clearly not the case. I mean, I think one would have to at least start from the starting point for this. I think would have to be how more than sort of 60 years after the end of European colonialism, Africa does remain so much poorer than Europe. I think one could at least say that the EU hasn't done a very good job in terms of helping Africa to develop. Whether one would call that neo-colonial is, I think, another question which I'm not really, as I say, qualified to answer.
And not to mention the way Europe treats people who try and get across the Mediterranean to get into Europe, which is increasingly going to be an issue. I mean, you mentioned the French elections. We have this great European Michel Barnier saying we should have a stop on immigration for 5 years. And what that actually means at the frontier, what it means on the island of Lesbos or wherever it may be, is extremely tough. So I think that's another way of saying, of course, those two things are closely connected, because if you're not going to let in more people from Africa, then you have to do more for Africa.
And that was sort of my point about the binary thinking too, because if Viktor Orban had said that, I think, pro-Europeans would have reacted in a somewhat different way than if Michel Barnier says that, or if Macron says something like this. Is precisely my point. I think we have a kind of a blind spot because we say, well, racism goes hand in hand with nationalism. Therefore, if you're a pro-European, this is not problematic. And I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Viktor Orban's project is precisely to define a non-liberal and indeed non-liberal democratic European Union, an alternative European Union. Excellent. Well, listen, I think we'll gradually bring this to a close. I'm going to see if anyone would like to make any last points in reverse order, perhaps. David, is there anything you'd like to add? Don't feel compelled to, but if there's anything you'd like to add, please do.
I spoke a lot, so I'd rather give Ione and Laura sort of the time to speak, and then I can go.
Great. Ione.
I think I'm going to echo David's words. I feel like I'm spoken quite a lot during more than I expected. So I'll let Laura speak, and if I think of anything really pressing, I will speak after David or her.
But I also have the same impression. I don't know. So I have not like nothing in particular to add to the conversation. I thought it was very interesting, coming from very different, I think, perspective and background. I think that the last question raised by Alistair, it's important. Like, I think it's something that we should that should be addressed. Like very, I don't know. It's very important to address the Euro-Africa relation right now. And I think that also talks about helping Africa and all this kind of thing. They should be, made very carefully, because there is an inherent colonial and inherent civilizing idea, I think, in saying something like that to some extent. Just saying that we are helping them and all this kind of thing. So I think that was, I think, maybe the only thing that I wanted to add. But apart from that, I think that the conversation was incredibly interesting, and that I think we should speak about the wideness of Europe more, because I think it's just something that at least it's not spoken as much as it should be, I would say, at least from my personal experience, that maybe, and of my European friends, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are kind of shocked when someone says that, which is why, Hans, there was such a reaction to the piece, which shows how helpful it is. David.
I think I would add to everything that we talked about, and yes, I definitely agree with Laura. I mean, we had a very, very productive discussion, and I wish we, as academic scholarly communities, would have more of these discussions. I think the one thing that to be really wary of when we talk about, rebuilding, recreating European identity, I want to quote something that Audre Lorde, who's an American Black feminist author and poet, once said, that you can never use the master's, hold up, I have it written down somewhere. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so I think we need to be very cautious about using sort of the master's tools, the tools that existed for centuries in European states, the tools of oppression, the tools of state violence, in order to sort of create a more, diverse European identity. I think we need to be very careful with this, because a lot of the things that we touched upon, they were sort of the modus operandi of European nations, things like colonialism, racism, etc. And what we, if we are to create a European identity, which is, I guess, something that Professor Gert Nash is arguing for, if we're to create a European civilizational identity that does away with all this stuff, we really have to transform the very nature of Europe.
Thank you very much, David. Hans.
Well, yes, maybe I'll just end by sort of saying something about the reaction to the piece, Tim, since you sort of mentioned that, because I think it sort of illustrates a few things about some of the issues we've been discussing, actually. I mean, a very simple way of putting it, I mean, first of all, I was sort of, amazed by the way it seemed to resonate, and how much demand there was to have this discussion, which is fantastic, and how open people were to it. But insofar as there was a sort of split in terms of reactions, it was kind of that some EU policymakers and think tankers, EU foreign policy think tankers, and and European studies academics were kind of outraged, as you were suggesting, Tim. And then on the other hand, other academics, particularly historians, but more broadly, I mean, certainly people from post-colonial studies, but more broadly historians, sort of thought it was almost sort of banal, what I was saying, because it was so obviously true. And so one of the things that's revealed to me was partly the sort of gap that exists between policymakers and academia. That was quite shocking to me, actually, how out of touch actually a lot of policymakers were with academic debates. But then within academia, and this is something that you touched on earlier, Tim, quite rightly, the gap between European studies and other academic disciplines, particularly history, let alone post-colonial studies. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking about quite a lot. And Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, who I've mentioned several times, who wrote Eurafrica, they've written a lot about this too, about the problematic way in which EU studies has contributed to a kind of mythologization of the EU rather than a sort of historicization of the EU. So I think that's very striking to me. And I guess the other thing that I would just say in conclusion is that one of the things we've been talking about a lot is the sort of need to be more aware of colonial histories in Europe, and I think that is true. I think there are some differences. I do think to come back to something that Ione said in her response. I do think that Britain has had a somewhat different approach to this than France has, for example. But that would be some. We would need more time to sort of do that comparison. But actually, the more important point to me is that I think the really important thing is that this isn't just a matter for the member states. This is why I think that book, Eurafrica, is so important, because there is this tendency, even if one says, we in France or we in Italy, in Laura's case, or we in Britain, need to engage with our colonial history, part of our national histories. There's this tendency to see that as being separate from the history of the EU. And so I think that the even more important thing, in a way, at least as far as this discussion goes, it's not just that Italy deals with its colonial history and that France deals with its colonial history, but that we recognize that particularly in this formative period, at the beginning of European integration, the EU was also relevant to this story. And played a role in this story, and it played a role in the colonial possessions of France and Belgium played a role in the development of the European project. And then I think that opens up the conversation which we just touched on, which is, okay, once you look at the beginning of the EU in that light, then I think it makes you look at the relationship between the EU and Africa in slightly different, now, today, including questions around migration, but also economic relations between the EU and Africa. It makes you look at those questions in a different way, and through a less mythologized kind of prism, right? That you at least ask the question, could there be some continuities between the colonial relationship between European states and Africa and the EU's relationship with Africa now? It at least opens up that possibility. So I just think it's absolutely crucial that when we have this conversation about the importance of understanding our colonial history, we're not just talking about EU member states, but we're also talking about the European Union itself.
Yeah, and I would add to that the particular problem seems to me at its most acute. It's interesting you mentioned EU policymakers and think tankers in Brussels. There is a real problem with the self-understanding of Brussels in particular. Well, Hans, that's great. You've given us at least two things to pursue in the next stage of our Dahrendorf program work, which is a big project for 2 years on Europe in a changing world, which is precisely trying to reverse the gaze and look at us as we are seen from China, India, Turkey, Russia, and so on. How we build a better critical understanding of our colonial histories, plural, into our understanding of our shared European history, singular. And actually the very tricky empirical question, which has been hovering around for the last hour and a half, of how we try and get at what non-white, non-British Europeans actually think about these things. Because you've been argued there's quite good evidence on on non-white British, but one would actually want to have some evidence, and there's a question about how we go about doing that. So that's just a couple of things that for me have been opened up by this absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you all very much. Alas, we don't get the torrent of applause from the audience on Zoom webinars, but you're used to that. But at least we can applaud ourselves, and thank you all. That was a great discussion.
Thank you very much for having me.